This is Chapter 1 of the International Relations class.
Happy learning.
What we're going to do here is talk about some basic actors and influences on the international system. We'll be talking about some general terminology in the international relations system. And we'll be kind of reviewing some things that we'll be talking about in more detail later on throughout the class. Now, when we look at international relations, short there at IR, we're looking at the relationship among the world's governments, i.e. the states and other transnational actors. And we live in a world of sovereign states that we'll talk about in more detail later on as we go. And the idea here for the international relations aspect of it is to try to serve the collective interests of all the states at the risk of foregoing their individual interests, which is what really drives things, is the state's individual interests. So it takes a lot of willpower, cooperation, and political and diplomacy, things like that, in order to try to get an international relations system to work. So we've got lots of what we call global collective goods that it's more efficient for us to approach these from a global perspective or an international perspective, such as peace, human rights, health issues, which we're dealing with right now, environmental issues, because environment is a global collective good. The last chapter of the book will be talking in detail about our biosphere and the environment. So we have numerous problems in trying to get this system to work. We have the problem of free riding, where some states will take advantage of what other powerful states are doing, and without really putting in much expense or effort, they'll be kind of tagging along and reaping the benefits of those agreements. There are what we call tragedy of the commons, where if each state is pursuing their own individual self-interests, such as maximizing their own economy or building up their own defenses, or just developing their own systems without any cause or concern for the environment, then what you could have here is this common area that we're all sharing, such as the biosphere or oceans or rivers or even peace, that can get spoiled if everybody is doing their own thing. So that's what we call the tragedy of the commons. And then prisoner's dilemma is a very popular game theory aspect where, again, if states are pursuing their own self-interest without communicating, then what could happen is that the states will end up with things that are not perhaps the best they could have gotten if they had cooperated or communicated instead. So we've got lots going on here in the international system to try to keep it together and make it work effectively. So to deal with this collective action problem, there's several different ways that we can do it. And one of the ways is through dominance of a single country or a handful of countries, this power hierarchy, and this is through a global hegemon. A hegemon serves, this superpower serves as a policeman that keeps all the other countries somewhat in line, and you could certainly argue that particularly since the end of the Cold War, the United States has been in that position where they could be a global policeman. We have pulled away from that role quite a bit since in the last decade or so, since the Iraq War and Afghanistan wars did not turn out as effective as we would hoped. We've kind of pulled back on this global policeman role. Clearly, during the Cold War, which we'll touch on here in a few minutes, we had two superpowers, and the world kind of was divided into two spheres, where those two superpowers were kind of calling the shots in their spheres and have a lot of influence in keeping things under control within their spheres, and that's a way of keeping things in check. Another way we look at it is through this concept of reciprocity, which on an individual human basis simply means that it's the golden rule. I'll treat you as I would want you to treat me. At the global system, we're looking at rewarding the behavior that contributes to the group, but punishing that behavior which pursues self-interest at the expense of the group. So this requires states to agree on what is appropriate behavior, and if somebody goes against that norm, then they can go against that particular, we're not talking about attacking them or war, but perhaps treating them in a way that would want them to get back in line with the norm of the rest of the group. Group identity is another thing that helps to, this has good and bad sides to it, because we'll talk about the identity of people, cultures, ethnicity, nation states. This is, at this time, the biggest source of conflict in the world. But having a culture that's bound together by a group identity, by a common ethnicity or a homogeneous population, you might say, that does serve to keep that country organized, under control, perhaps even peaceful, and allows the government to perhaps influence that group because everybody's a little bit more on the same page, that sort of thing. But in areas where you have numerous different factions of ethnic groups and cultures, big source of conflict, as we'll talk about in more detail later on. But having a strong group identity is one way that we can try to overcome these collective action problems. Now let's talk about some major terminology here. The state, which is synonymous with the countries of the world. We have about almost 200 countries in the world, and we typically designate that as the states of the world. This is the unit of government that exercises legal authority over a specific territory and the people. The United States is a state. Russia is a state. Venezuela is a state. It's a primary unit of our global system. All the states are calling their own shots for the most part, and that's where this concept of sovereignty comes into play. It is probably the single biggest hard and fast rule in our international system. We'll talk about how the modern states of the world formed over the past few centuries. And sovereignty is the common rule that once you are recognized as a state, then you are your own autonomous decision maker with no legitimate external higher authority. You don't report to anybody else higher than you. So that's why it requires cooperation between states. States can agree to cooperate or agree to join an international organization or agree to a treaty, but they can also agree not to do that and go their own way. So that's why we have so much differences and conflict in the world today, is because of the states are given that power to do as they please, their own decision-making body. And it has served us fairly well as far as this concept of the state over the past few centuries. But as we get into a more complicated world where cooperation might be even more and more necessary, well, then we see there could be some potential problematic elements with states just following their own self-interest, particularly when you have one state that might be a democracy and one state that really does not really care or respect for democracy. So looking at the primary actors in our international system, we have the heads of states, presidents, such as in the democratic states. Prime ministers is another name for a head of government. That's particularly the head of that parliament body that is elected by the people, and then whoever's head of the parliament is the prime minister, sometimes called the premier or the chancellor, the leader of the legislative body. Then the foreign ministers, these are the secretaries of state, the ambassadors, the envoys that are chosen to go and hammer out and work out these details of treaties and international agreements. Gross domestic product is probably the most common term that is used to measure the economy of a state. It measures a state's total economic activity, which is measured mostly as consumption of goods within government expense, investment, and net exports as part of that equation. Now, there's other things that we can measure other than gross domestic product, of course, but if you have a very large gross domestic product, that means you do have capacity for more health care and more leisure activities and more consumer goods and things like that. So it does say a lot, it does describe a lot about your country if you have a large GDP per capita, but it doesn't obviously tell everything. So that's why we're going to get into that into more detail in later chapters, talking about other ways of measuring the health of a country. Now, the concept of nation state, we're going to talk about this more in detail when we talk about conflict, because the desire for a culturally homogeneous population to become a state, that has created quite a bit of conflict over the past few decades. But the nation itself is typically defined as a population that shares a common ethnicity. And ethnicity simply means that you share cultural patterns of language. That's one of the biggest bonds that brings people together as far as ethnicity. A shared religion, a shared history, a shared national origin. These are things that bind people together that we could define as an ethnicity. Now, race is something different, because in America we define race particularly by skin color and facial traits. But when you look at the global system, people are bound together by much deeper roots than that, which go way back: common language, common history, or even a shared oppression, shared dominance of their group of people. Now, in the post-colonial era, when the superpowers eventually relinquished all of their colonial subjects, there was a big mismatch between what was perceived as a nation by the people and what was actually given to them as borders. And that has continued even to this day to be a big source of consternation and conflict, because you have people of shared ethnicities that are actually spilling over different borders, or you have people within a so-called state that do not have any interest in sharing power or coexisting with another ethnic group within that same country. So that this desire for nationalism, to where that particular group wants to unite their culture and put it in their own borders and create their own nation state, this has created quite a bit of conflict over the past few decades that we'll get into in more detail later on. However, there's not really such a thing as a pure nation state out there in the world, because you have so many groups of people that are overlapping or sharing certain types of regions, particularly within a sovereign state. We will get into this later on, but if you have all these groups out there that are desiring their own country, well, that could really become problematic, because then you might even break up an existing country into 15 or different countries, and you may not really solve any problem other than and you might actually just create more conflict by everybody having their own state. So we'll have to get into that into more detail later on. So other transnational actors we're looking at are international governmental organizations, and we shorten that as IO, international organizations. Here we are specifically talking about the groups that are formed by the states. The states come together and create these groups, such as the UN or the IMF, which is the International Monetary Fund, or the World Bank, or the World Trade Organization. They are created specifically by the states, so the states can delegate certain activities to them to make things more efficient and try to create more cooperation on the world order. So we'll talk about all of these things in more detail. NGOs are the non-governmental organizations that are typically formed by individuals or groups of people. These are private organizations that are typically nonprofit, and what they are trying to do is solve problems more so at the grassroots level, transcending borders, because a lot of the problems of the world are not being solved by the governments of those states, particularly the poor states or the states that are just rife with conflict. And so NGOs come in there and try to help people that are starving or that are racked with disease and can't get help, can't get drugs. So NGOs try to reach those people primarily because those people's governments are ineffective and they can't really help them all that much. So they rely on donations and grants from the powerful countries. Multinational corporations are the major player in our global economic sphere. We'll talk about them in a lot more detail later. They provide a lot of jobs for people. This is where the foreign direct investment originates from, because multinational corporations are always looking for investment opportunities in other countries. And so therefore, poor countries would like multinationals to come to their country and invest and build and hire people and provide tax revenue. So those are some major transnational actors. Now, looking at the term globalization, this is something we'll talk about in a little bit more detail as well, because particularly since the end of World War II, and even then again after the end of the Cold War, we've had an increasing integration of economies, telecommunications, transportation, even culture across boundaries. And this has been mostly associated with global capitalism, which is what we'll do when we look at it in terms of economics later on in the chapter. But there are some major views of globalization. One, of course, is the neoliberal view, which has really promoted the idea of an expanding global capitalist system to where there has been somewhat of a fruition of market economic principles that have brought the world more in line with a capitalist view. The Marxist view is somewhat skeptical of that. We have increasing inequality and potential for conflict with the competition involved in capitalist pursuits. Now, of course, inequality is going to exist regardless of whether you have a socialist system or capitalist system. The transformational view is looking at to where this increasing integration of our global economies could be eroding state sovereignty. However, there could be an interesting hybrid going on here, where as countries get more and more interdependent and integrated in their economies, that may be resulting in a backlash where states are pursuing or trying to recap some of their sovereignty. Now, globalization is all around us, in that there are lots of products that we depend on. If it wasn't for trade, I wouldn't be able to have my cup of coffee in the morning or put the banana in my oatmeal. This is just a list here that was put together by an author of a previous edition of the textbook, who was just looking at things on his desk at first and then started to realize how many things that we get from other countries that we depend on. We will be talking about the rich versus poor gap in the world, also referred to as the North-South gap, which results from many centuries of colonialism, where the North states, particularly Western European and their expansionists, are the economically developed countries, the rich countries of the world, and the poor countries of the world were typically in the southern hemisphere, called the least developed countries. So we will examine that rich versus poor divide. We see the North contains 20% of the world's population, but 55% of all the goods and services produced and consumed in the world. We're looking at lots of maps, and as you can see, the richest countries of the world are Western Europe and the states that expanded out of that northern hemisphere, as well as Australia, North America, Japan, and then of course Scandinavian countries. And they all, when we look at all other demographics, they also are at the top of the list on all those as well. In the poor countries of the world, when we look at other maps of other demographics, these countries will always be at the bottom of the list, particularly in Africa, in Asia, poorest countries of the world. We'll look at some of the reasons why that is, what are the obstacles to development. Just a brief look at how our international system has evolved. We won't spend much time talking about wars. We do know that at the end of World War I, the League of Nations came into being. The United States, however, decided not to go into that. And we saw that between the wars is when we had what is called the multipolar system. It's where the United States was one of the superpowers of the world, along with Great Britain. It still had its empire. We also saw the rise of Germany and Japan and their imperial systems there, and then the rise of those states and the conflicting tensions between those rising states, and perhaps the decline of the British Empire. We started to see the tensions building into World War II, which was a very catastrophic war. And it was because of World War II, the aftermath of that is when the winners of World War II, particularly the United States and Great Britain, came together and set up the framework of our international institutions that we still use today, where they set up the institutions such as the United Nations, International Monetary Fund, World Bank, World Trade Organization, and those are still the foundational organizations of the global system even to this day. The Cold War also developed in the aftermath of World War II. Even though we were allied with the Soviet Union, we did not really trust communism, and that we diverged very quickly after World War II, and that is what we call the bipolar period, where we had the two major global hegemons and their spheres of influence. The United States Marshall Plan, which was used to help develop the Europe after the devastation of World War II, did not include Soviet Union. We also created the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, referred to as NATO, which created a zone of security for Europe in their redevelopment. And then when the Soviet Union got their nuclear weapons, then the nuclear arms race began, creating the concept of deterrence, where if one country has nuclear weapons, then the other country will not attack them, and vice versa. The divide was over democratic capitalism versus autocratic communism during this period. Also, during the Cold War, communist containment was the main general international philosophy for the United States, where we had the Korean War, the arms race and the space race, inspired by the Sputnik, where the Soviets got into space first. Cuban Missile Crisis considered the turning point of this concept of deterrence. And the Vietnam War was a proxy war for the Cold War, further communist containment, and 58,000 casualties in that war, and ended without really any benefit coming out of it. The collapse of the Soviet Union ended the Cold War, and it was kind of determined at that point that maybe capitalism and democracy had won out, but we then shift into the unipolar system where the United States is the sole superpower. And we also had some cooperation there even with the Soviet Union in the Gulf War in trying to push Saddam Hussein back from Kuwait. Bosnian War showed that we have different type of wars starting to develop now between ethnic groups and identity groups that would kind of be the major source of conflict even in the world today. Then with 9/11, the world changed again into the era of the war on terrorism, where the United States, being the global hegemon, kind of led these efforts. But they did not turn out as successful as we had planned. The Iraq War then was an effort to get rid of Saddam Hussein. There's been some mixed results from that, and even now we're seeing kind of pulling back from the war on terrorism. And so what we will now do after this chapter is go ahead and get into the specifics of international relations. In the next chapter, we'll talk about the concept of realist behavior in the international system.